Welcome, Marianne Christensen. Great to have you.
Thank you.
So Marianne, it's so fun. You're my first storyteller, and why don't we just go kind of way back? I'm guessing when you grew up as a child, did you enjoy stories? Did your mom or your dad read stories to you?
Not really, because they were busy and we were many children. But my grandfather, my mother's father, he read stories to us.
Okay.
He read from a book with the tales from Hans Christian Andersen.
Uh-huh.
And, of course, he's Danish, and he always read the same tale to us, and we loved that tale. So.
Now that's interesting. Since you bring up Hans Christian Andersen, let me ask you, because I've wondered about this. Sometimes I think I've read that he kind of water down some fairy tales or make them kind of acceptable within a Christian framework. Because some of the, tell me if this is true, some of the more classical fairy tales, they can get pretty gory, they can have some pretty tough plot lines in them, can't they?
Yeah, and the fairy tales, like for example the Grimm stories, they came from France. A lot of them came from France, and they must have come from the East, from the Middle East originally, and there were many different types of stories from that area. But then they made it into literature. But Hans Christian Andersen, he transformed some of them completely, so that they fit in with the culture at that time, and also he personalized them a lot. We call there are folk tales, and then there are what we call artistic tales.
Okay. Okay.
You know, when they have been
embellished.
Changed, they have been adapted into something different.
Okay, interesting. All right, so let me carry on a little bit with your chronology here. So your grandfather read you stories, and then
and he
and
told
I guess
stories.
Pardon?
He told lots of stories. Always at the dinner table, he would, and after dinner he would sit and lean back, and then he would just start telling stories from his childhood, and stories about people he knew, and stories that were going on in town, and so on. So there were stories all over all the time when he was there.
So your grandfather was not only a great storyteller, he had tons of stories in his head, but he could also read stories from books too. Okay.
Yes.
All right.
That's right.
And then at what age did you start to pursue this a little more seriously yourself?
Well, if you hadn't said seriously, I would say I started already when I could talk. Because I was told that, I don't remember this myself, but I was told that I was really good at making up stories when I was a child. So I grew up for the first 6 years on a farm, and I was left alone a lot, and then I did things that I weren't allowed to do, and then I would always...
Oh, you naughty thing, Marianne.
I was a really naughty girl. But it was really not dangerous or anything, but I would always say I hadn't done it whenever they would ask me. So my mother says I started making stories at that time. But later I became a teacher for children, and I read stories for them, but also I told stories. And later again I became an adult teacher, and I found out that sometimes the young people, they needed a story, and I started working with healing story around 2000, and in the beginning of the 2000s, and finally I went to a big conference in 2005. And I learned a lot about metaphors and how metaphors can implement people's lives and can change things. So that's when I really started doing storytelling with metaphors. But professionally, I started in 2000, around 2000, I think.
Well, very, very interesting. So you became a teacher. Did you teach at what level? What grade level were you teaching?
Well, in Denmark, the teachers at that time, we taught all levels from first class to 10th grade. And then when I became adult teacher, it was like a second chance school, where people could come and learn more and have an exam that they hadn't had when they were in public school. So that was 8th and 9th, 10th grade.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
So
For adults.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It's kind of a nice overlap, teaching and storytelling. It kind of goes hand in hand.
Very, yeah.
And you referred to a kind of storytelling that I've heard referenced before. Maybe you can define it for us. Did you say it's healing stories?
Yeah, there is an alliance in the United States called Healing Story Alliance, and I learned about that in the beginning of the 2000s, and got some friends there, and it's because we believe that there is a magic to stories, that sometimes an old folk tale can explain something that's hard to explain if you address it directly to a person. But if you wrap it into a story, then it's much easier for the person to understand it, because they can get it up at a subconscious level sometimes through the story.
Yes,
So
that's very, very interesting.
Yeah, that's very, very great tool to have when you work with people.
Yeah, I find that whole area fascinating. I'm kind of a fan of Carl Jung and Marie-Louise von Franz.
Yeah.
And she did quite a bit of writing on fairy tales and kind of the psychological interpretation of fairy tales. And I think there's a lot of powerful principles are conveyed in a lot of those ancient fairy tales.
Yeah.
So, okay.
I
Go ahead.
was inspired by Jung also, because I went to a conference where that was actually in, I think, 1997 or something already, that I learned about how you could interpret fairy tales through his ways of thinking. But there are many, many more ways than that, and I think that each person finds her own way, his or her own way, because it always has to be connected directly to the person that you're talking to or telling to. If you work with your there are so many words that I don't really know how to...
Your English is excellent. Your English is excellent.
Okay. But as a therapist, I work with people's life stories, and sometimes they need a fairy tale, or they need just a story that I can make up on the spot, so that to make a metaphor for their problem or their challenge, whatever you call it.
Very interesting. So it sounds like some of the elements that you apply are intuitive, and then kind of quick thinking on your feet, and then perhaps using pieces of different stories, and then creating whole new stories to convey something.
Right. That's the way I use it, but there are many different points of views in this area, because there are some people who think that you should tell the fairy tales as you have read them, and not go out of the way and make up anything, and not modernize them. And in Denmark, there is a tendency that the fairy tales are being modernized a lot. So instead of riding on a horse, for example, he will come on a motorbike or something like that. And he will wear a leather jacket, or that they're put into a modern frame. And that's a big discussion that's going on, because if the fairy tales hadn't been written down, then they would have passed on from mouth to ear again and again, like they were earlier. And we don't know how they would have developed naturally. So maybe they would have changed, and we see when we read the tales that they have changed according to the culture around them.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Could you give us an example of some of the ways in which a fairy tale conveys an important principle to a child? So a lot of these tales, they kind of teach children maybe ethical behavior, or perhaps safety, principles of safety. I mean, it could be all kinds of things. Can you think of an example of that?
For example, Well, if we go back to Hans Christian Andersen, there's a story about the old folk tales. There are always these three brothers, you know, where the youngest one is the one who is not allowed to go with the older brothers, and then he's the one who has the best of luck. And there is a story that I don't really know the name in English, but it's Hans. And he's the one who gains the princess. And maybe you know the fairy tale because it's quite famous, I think, where he's not allowed to go and woo to the princess. So because his elder brothers have the horses, the fine horses. But then he takes a goat and he rides along on a goat. And the older brothers are very clever. They know lots and lots of intellectual skills. He doesn't know a lot, but he's very quick. So the first thing he finds on his way is, I think he finds a dead crow, and he picks it up, and then he finds the shell of a wooden shoe, and then he finds some mud, and he puts it in his pockets. And then when he gets to the castle, the king's castle, and gets into the princess, it's very hot there. And every time somebody mentions that it's very hot, then they go, what? They get all confused and they don't know what to answer. And then she just, out, she says, no good, out. And you know that thing. So when he comes in, he also says that it's very hot in the room. And she says, yes, that's because we are frying chicken. And he says, oh my, am I lucky. I just have something, maybe I can make my own fried bird. And then he picks out this dead crow from his pocket. And she says, no, that's no good because you don't have a pan for it. And then he takes out the wooden shoe and he says, can this do as a pan? And she said, yeah, but you don't have any gravy. And then he finally picks out the mud from his pocket and she says, well, and she starts laughing. And then, of course, he can have him. And he can have her, earns her and the half of the kingdom, and later he becomes a king. And that's a very typical tale. But this one is good for children because, even though somebody says you might be stupid and you don't know how to read well or how to know a lot of things, then you can still be wise. And wisdom is not about knowing a lot of things, but it's about thinking.
Yes, that's very interesting. Intuition and kind of using what you're given, right? Using the tools that you're given.
And pick up the gifts that you meet on your way, because he says, I never know when I can use it. And the boys, the brothers, they are really scolding him and laughing at him and saying, oh, you're so crazy. How can you do that? And so on. But he says, maybe I can use it. I never know when I get to use this. It's not that we're supposed to pick up everything we meet on the way, but it's about seeing the presents that are in life for you and noticing things and seeing things so that maybe one day it'll be useful to you.
Beautiful.
I think that's the whole point of this fairy tale.
Beautiful. I'd love to hear a little bit about how you have progressed in your storytelling. So it sounds like probably when you were teaching, you kind of were developing these skills already, and perhaps even sometimes telling stories when you were teaching kids. So can you tell us a little bit about developing the confidence to tell a story? And is it a little bit of a matter of repetition and doing it again and again and kind of refining as you go along, and perhaps seeing other storytellers and picking up ideas along the way? Tell us about your progression.
Okay. When I had been doing theater for some years, amateur theater and also semi-professional theater, and the reason why I changed was that it was very difficult to coordinate calendars all the time with many people in a play and so on. So I decided that I wanted to work alone. But then I started with a simple weekend course about storytelling, and at that course I decided I will never be a storyteller because the others, they were so good. But then I was told that I was good also, so they thought I should go on with it. but it was a big problem for me because I had a big lack of self-esteem, and I thought, well, I'll never get as good as the big good ones. But then I started telling, and there is really only one way to learn to tell stories, and that is by telling stories.
Yeah, yeah.
And then also to listen a lot. To be a good storyteller, you need to listen. And I've always been a person who, if I sat on a train or sat on a bench in the street, or I saw people, I would make up stories about these people. Try to imagine what happened before they came here and what happens when they leave this place. So that's the whole secret of a narrative. There's a beginning and there's a middle and then there's an ending. And it really is that simple. But then, of course, you can put all kinds of images and happenings in the story. When I had learned a lot about these metaphors, I tried it out, and there was one specific occasion I remember that I had a boy. I called him a boy, but he was actually a young, grown-up man, and he could never concentrate in class at that adult school. And he would always sit and stare out of the window. So one day I decided, everybody were working on something, they were writing something, and then he would just sit there and stare out of the window, and then I interrupted the class and I said, can I tell you a story? And they said, yeah, sure, and they put down their pencils, and then I started telling. And I told a story about a boy who was sitting in his room, and then a bird landed in front of him, and the boy was transformed into a tiny little boy, and then he would fly out of the window and he would experience all kinds of things out there in the world. But then the secret was I brought him back into the room because I knew he was daydreaming, and I wanted to bring him back into the room so that he would be conscious of what he was doing, instead of saying, oh, you should really do your homework, or whatever I could have said if I was that kind of a teacher.
Right.
But then I forgot all about the story because I made it up on the spot, and my aim was to bring him consciously back to the classroom. And then,
did it work?
It worked perfectly. And then after summer vacation, he came back into my class for another subject. And then one of the first things he said, one of the first days we were in class, he said, could you please read that story again? I said, what story? Because this was months ago. And he said, yeah, well, you read a story for us once, and it was a wonderful story. And for one thing, I hadn't read the story. I had told it out of nothing. And then I had forgotten the story because it was his story. So I said, well, I would love to tell the story again, but I would much more prefer that you told it, because I knew that I couldn't recall it. So I asked him what it was about, and I led him through the story with questions. And then he told the whole story.
That's incredible, Marianne. That is incredible. You know, that is so powerful. Now, do you think he didn't consciously recognize that you had done that to solve his attention?
No, not at all.
That's incredible.
Because if you think deeper about it, I allowed him to daydream, but I wanted to lead him back to the classroom, and that's what happened. And he came back and he concentrated. And actually from that day on, he was not daydreaming so much. He would still do it, but then I would just let him, and then he would come back very easily again. And his problem was concentration. And that was why he had not passed any test when he was in the normal school for children. So that's why he came back to get some education and to prove that he could actually learn. So I was very happy about that. And
You know, when I went to college, I wish I had had a professor tell me that story, because many of my classes in college, I was sleeping on the desk.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's brilliant.
Yeah, but that's just an example of how stories work. And also stories can be very comforting if I can tell another story.
Yeah.
I have worked for some years as a hypnotherapist also.
Uh-huh.
I've done many things in my life, and that's part of my life story, of course. But I had a woman who came to me because she had developed a phobia against, I don't know if you say against or towards birds. She had a bird phobia.
Huh.
And it was really, really, there was no reason at all why she should be afraid of birds. And she saw dead birds everywhere. And birds would fly into her house and everything.
Weird.
And there was no connection to anything. And I couldn't figure out what it was. And then finally, when she came here, just the thought of a bird made her cry. And this was really a bad thing for her.
Wow.
And then we worked, of course, with the phobia through hypnosis. But then finally I found out that she had lost her father when she was 12 years old. He had died, and she and her her father and her had a thing together about birds. She had birds in a cage in her home, and it was a thing that she had with her father. So I won't go into the deeper psychological thing about this, but anyway, I found out that she needed something to finish the thing about her father dying, and she told me she had never ever been allowed to talk about how she missed her father.
Oh.
And he hadn't been very old, of course, when he died. So I told her a story where I transformed a part of the northern mythology into my own story, and it's very short, so I can tell it. And if you know anything about the Norse mythology, you know that there is a tree in the middle of the world called Yggdrasil. It's a tree of life.
Okay. Yes.
And by the root of that tree, I'll cut away a lot of details, but at the root of that tree, and now is the way I told the story, there are 3 goddesses, and they are spinning the life thread for people. So they decide the lengths of people's lives. And then I say that at one side there's a woman who she sits with, there's one of the goddesses, she sits with these things that you use when you spin wool yarn.
Yeah, like a wheel, a spinning wheel.
Yeah, the one in the middle, she's sitting at a spinning wheel, and then the other one to one side, she has these combs that you need to put the
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know the name of these things.
Yeah.
But she catches sun rays and moonlight and star beams and so on, and she uses that for the material that she gives to the one in the middle who sits with the spinning wheel.
Beautiful.
Yeah. She spins and she spins, and on the other side there's a woman sitting with a big pair of scissors, and she cuts a thread. And the whole thing is that when she spins, she has a certain rhythm that she spins in. You know, when you thread the spinning wheel, there's a rhythm that you need to keep. And also the woman who's combing, she needs to keep a certain rhythm to pass her the fibers and so on. And she cuts and she cuts and she cuts. But, and here's the thing, when women are together, and probably also men, but these are women, when they're together, they start telling stories to each other. And what happens when you listen to a story? You forget everything around you. You forget time and you forget everything. And you get caught into the story. And this also happens to the woman who sits with the scissors. So she forgets to cut. And that way there's a person who has a totally long life thread. And he becomes way too old. So he's so old that he can hardly stand living in the end. And then she gets really embarrassed because she forgot to cut. Because people were supposed to have the same length of life. So to compensate, she cuts really fast. And then she cuts tiny little pieces so that there are some children, they will never be born. And there are some that are just born, but they don't live very long. And there are some that become 15, maybe 17, and there are some that become only 30 or 35, and so on. And that's why people have different lengths of life.
That's beautiful, beautiful.
So when I had told her that story, she just had tears rolling down her cheeks, and she said, I really, really wish somebody had told me that story when I was 12 years old and I lost my father. But then I said, you can be 12 years old now and you can listen, you have listened to the story and you can take it into your heart, and then you can realize that there was no way your father could live any longer because his life thread had run out.
That's beautiful, Marianne. Beautiful. You know, we talked a little earlier. You said, I guess you frequently have storytellers over. Well, you have so many things going on. Let me do this now before I forget. Can you tell the viewers the name of your website so they can look you up if they want to?
Yes, it's Marianne Christensen.dk. And
Okay.
Marianne is like Marianne. I can
Oh yeah,
spell,
I'll put it in the video. I'll spell it out in the video for them.
Okay, that's fine.
All right.
And then yes, I lost my husband 6 years ago, and I live in the house that we had been living in for many, many years. And one evening I was sitting here and I was thinking, it's really not that funny to sit alone in living rooms and by my dining table and so on. It's really boring in a way. Not that I'm ever bored, but you know, we used to have lots of guests over, and he would do lots of cooking and invite people and so on. And then I was thinking, I cannot afford to invite people to give them dinner and to serve them things. So I was thinking, how can I have people come over and not having to spend a lot of money on it? And that's when I came up with the idea that I would make something that I call living room stories. And then it means that I invite people into my house once a month now. And they come here and I invite some of my storytelling friends who are excellent professional storytellers. And they come here and help me for an evening. I serve them a dinner. And then the people come and they pay an entrance or, you know, donation.
Yeah.
And then we have coffee or tea, and then they have homemade cake every time.
Beautiful, beautiful.
Wonderful woman who bakes the cakes, so it's a wonderful project, and I get the money for it. So
that's good.
Yeah, it's good. It's not very much, but it's a little, just a little to add to my income. And it's a wonderful evening. They sit in my sofa, they sit around my dining table, and they sit wherever there's room. And they are so used to listening that they just sit there and they listen and listen and listen. And we have this going on for 2 hours.
Wow.
Yeah.
So is it kind of like so I guess the professionals, of course, tell stories, and then other people participating are allowed to tell stories also if they want to?
Oh no, because they don't want to do that. They come to hear stories.
Okay.
Most of them would be too shy to tell stories themselves, but that's another way I could do it. I could invite people to come and tell stories. But this is a treat for them that I invite my friends that they don't know about storytellers because we're not famous in Denmark like actors or musicians. Storytelling is not that big, but we're working on making it big.
Yes. Well, and tell us a little bit about these professionals. So you've kind of gotten yourself connected with all these storytellers in Denmark. And tell me, just off to the side, of course, Danish is the primary language. Is it common in Denmark to also speak German or French or English?
We have to learn English in school.
Okay.
As a second language, or whatever you can call it, because Danish is our mother tongue, and then we learn English from I think from first grade now actually, and then later we can choose German or French or Spanish, and then when we come to high school, I think they can choose other languages as well, like Japanese or Chinese, because we have a lot of trading going on with China, so many people want to learn Chinese these days. But English is absolutely, we must have English.
Okay.
That's why most people in Denmark speak English.
Okay.
And then German is sort of voluntarily not many like to learn to speak German because they think it's a very difficult language. But French is more difficult, I think, because it's another language group. German and Danish is very much alike once you get into it.
Yeah.
But the German grammar is more complicated.
Interesting.
So we do speak different languages, yes.
And is Danish very different from Swedish?
No.
Okay.
Intonation is different, but the words are the same. They're just pronounced differently. But actually, in Swedish and Danish, there are only about 500 words that differ, and that means something totally different.
Huh. Okay.
But Norwegian is they write the letters as they, or the words as they say them. So when we read Norwegian, it's like Danish, but it's misspelled.
Okay. All right. So when you have these living room gatherings, how many professional storytellers do you have present, and about how long is the average story, or does it totally vary?
It varies, but I have this year I have 2 storytellers and myself, and then I also have I offer an artist to come and hang up a picture on my wall. I have a wall where there's nothing except something to hang. There's something you can hang pictures on. So each month I have a painter who come and present an artwork. And
I
then
love it.
Yeah.
It's so cool what you're doing. So interesting. Now, the viewers can see. I know behind you. You mentioned you had someone at the house recently, and they did a drawing. Now, that was part of a story, or what was that about?
Show you. This is a very well-known storyteller in Denmark called Carsten Islington. He I don't know if you can see what it is.
It looks like. Tell me if I've got. Is it an ogre maybe, or maybe a gnome or something like that?
Yeah, there's in the corner. I think that you can see in the corner at the bottom. There's a little gnome.
Okay.
Yeah, and he's running for his life because he has a big troll after him.
A troll. Okay, troll. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and
now
then,
this is. I'm really glad you're bringing this up. Tell us a little bit about gnomes. So are gnomes generally positive, or can they be positive or negative, or?
It really depends on where they are, because there are some. Well, gnomes are actually little people that live in the ground, but trolls are big things that live in the mountains or in the forest, and also they can live near the water. But big trolls, they can be very evil, and they can be really, really nice.
Oh, trolls can be nice.
They can be really nice, but usually they are not that nice. Usually they to ruin things and disturb peace and so on. But we have the little, I don't know if you call them pixies or something like that, but the little ones that are the one who's running there.
Yeah.
They are nice, and they come into people's houses, and if you feed them with what do you call it? I can't remember the word right now. But if you give them something to eat, then they'll be really kind to you. But they can also be very teaseful. They can tease you and move things around in the house and so on.
Very interesting. They remind me of, I have some Irish ancestry, and they talk about the little people in Ireland, and I imagine it's the same.
I think it's more or less the same, but there are also these, that's very, very common in Iceland, and also in Norway, and well, some people believe in these little fairies and the nymphs and so on. They're tiny little things that are in the forests. Yeah. And the different nymphs. Nymphs are usually around water, and fairies are in the forest. But there are also little beings that live all kinds of places.
Yeah, this is fascinating. Now, something that interests me about this, and maybe you can address this a little bit. So, of course, in Denmark, you have, and your name is, right, Christensen. So there's this history of Christian influence within Denmark, and then prior to that, is it right to think that it would be Celtic prior to Christianity, or some?
No. We didn't have the Celtic belief here. We had what we call the Ase belief, that they have it in Iceland still a lot, and it's coming up a little here. We believed in, or people believed in the northern gods like Odin and Thor and
Yes.
Aya and all these. That's a Norse mythology. That's
Okay.
what they believed in. And the gods are equivalent to the Greek and Roman gods, but they had different names and different things. And at that time, people really didn't think that there was one God. They believed that there were many gods who took care of things. Like
Very interesting.
Took care of the weather, and one took care of love and war and so on.
Well, and I guess, I don't know if you've seen some of this Viking series that's gotten popular. Very interesting, and they're talking about Odin and Thor, and I guess, did you have a kind of shamanic tradition in Denmark in conjunction with the Norse mythology?
I wouldn't really say a shamanic tradition, because the shaman thing or shamanic was more the original shamanism came from North Siberia in Russia, and it has spread. Also, the Sami people in northern Sweden and Norway and Finland had some. They have shamans and Indians and so on, but in Denmark it was more like there were rituals to offer things to the gods, and there were lots and lots of also what we would today call very bad rituals, because they would offer people. And we have these areas in nature where it's a very humid area where there's water, and I don't know the English word for it, but it's a place where you shouldn't go out because you sink in, and it's so
like
soft.
A swamp. Yeah.
A swamp. And in these areas, they have found many skeletons from people and animals from very, very old times, when they have offered these people, and they have been preserved in these swamps, so they can pick them up now and see how they have been doing it. I don't know why they did it that way, but they must have had some reason to do it. But that's how they offered presents to the gods. And
that's very interesting. You're reminding me of a story I heard once, and maybe you can tell me if you've heard it in Denmark. But I think some of these sacrifices and offerings to the gods may have been related to the weather, and they may have been related to trying to bring the sun back,
right.
After winter. And there's a story I heard about where it was suggested that the tradition of using the Christmas tree, which actually predates Christianity, the suggestion in the story was that a town was doing sacrifices of children to bring the sun back, and then a stranger came and taught the people that instead of using the children or human beings, you can sacrifice a tree, and that this replaced the sacrifice of humans. And then, of course, the Christian or the Catholic tradition comes in and appropriates many existing spiritual practices and kind of puts the acceptable covering of Christianity on top of it. But anyway, have you come across that story?
No, I never heard. I would actually be interested in finding out where it came from.
Okay.
So if you can find it, you can mail it to me. It would be really nice to have that story.
Okay.
But the tree has always been a symbol of fertility and growth. And of course, we have 4 seasons in Denmark, and people have always been celebrating spring solstice, I think, now equinox, spring and fall equinox, and summer and winter solstice.
Yes.
And there have been many rituals around that. And of course, before they had a calendar, they had cycles, so that they wouldn't count in years, they would count in moons and in cycles. so that they would celebrate whenever the sun came out again after a long winter, and that would be spring equinox. And we celebrate that actually around the world now with the World Storytelling Day on spring equinox.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, or 21st of March every year. And we have a subject for every year.
Well,
and then when the summer was at its hottest in June, then they had already planted the seeds and they needed to pray for good growth and for good weather during the summer. And then after that in September, they would celebrate the harvest and they would prepare to close everything down for the winter time. And then in the midwinter in December, they would pray or they would tuck in together and they would sit and have cozy rituals with lots of food and just rest. Because in the winter you're supposed to rest, you're not supposed to be jumping around and stress out like the trees. Everything, goes inside in the winter time.
Right.
Yeah. So,
there's so many topics here that are intertwined. It's really fascinating. I'm a big fan of mythology and different religions and stories that have kind of been handed down and played an important role in culture for so many years. What could you say in general? I mean, probably a lot of our viewers are probably familiar with like Joseph Campbell, that sort of thing. And I sense from you, it's like storytelling has this communal aspect that's very ancient. So what could you say to kind of define the importance of the role of mythology, storytelling in our culture in general? And perhaps you could tie in with that how our cultures are somewhat lacking that right now. There's been a kind of a loss, perhaps.
Originally the myths were, as I see it, they were made up to explain how we got here. And then the fairy tales and these kind of stories were made up to say, now that we're here, how shall we behave towards each other? So they are very moral stories. So they're all meant to explain, but there are also lots and lots of stories who are meant to just entertain people. And we have found some old stories that they have been known for a long time, but we have taken up again in a couple of 100 years ago. There was a man who would travel around in Denmark and he would collect people stories that people told to each other. And that was just to have a laugh about people who were crazy or people who did stupid things or people who were heroes. And, you can laugh at people who are worse than yourself, or you can look up to people who are better than yourself. If you take it that way. And I think that some of the stories have had that, that purpose, so that, if you're bad off and you're poor and you live way out in the country, as some of them did that time, at least you can always tell some good stories about somebody who was stupid, so that you are poor, yes, but you're not stupid. And that way, and I think that today the stories can be very entertaining, but when you use them in a way where you pick a story because you think that it has a certain impact on the person that you tell it to, then it's a little like manipulating. But we can discuss if it's okay or if it's not okay, because if the story helps the person, then it's okay to manipulate. But you can never know what in a story will change the person's mind, or how one word or one sentence or one episode will have an impact on that person's way of thinking. So you cannot plan ahead how to manipulate.
Interesting, very interesting. Now you're saying that makes me think of, I sense that intuition is a big part of this, and when you're, in a sense, you as you alluded to earlier, there's a theatrical component to storytelling. There's a little bit of acting and expressing emotions, and maybe you can tell me if I'm right. It seems like when you're on that stage, you're in front of a group of people. Things will happen that you didn't expect that will help evolve the story, and it's all tied in with that. Your expression of emotions, what you're perceiving from the people that are listening, things that popped into your head earlier that day, what the weather's like. All of these things are going to influence the story, right?
Right. That's my experience, and I never, ever, ever learn a story word by word, and I don't think that there are many storytellers who do that, because that would be really, they would be bad off if they did that, and you could tell immediately.
Be boring.
The most important thing about telling is, like I said in the beginning, is listening. And as a storyteller, you need to be in a state where you have your story in your mind. Of course, you remember the story and you know the line in the story, but also you have to have part of yourself out in the audience, listening to the reactions from the audience. And if you're not able to do that, you're not going to be a really, really good storyteller. Because if you're that stiff, because it's a flow, it's a movement between the listener and the storyteller. So that many of my stories will differ from one audience to another. I still have the red thread in the story, and the plot is always the same.
Yeah.
And sometimes I have a beginning and an ending that is always the same, but it depends on the reaction, how I emphasize certain parts of the story.
Very interesting. And I liked what you said earlier. There's kind of a debate within the storytelling community about whether or not some of these older stories should be updated in terms of, the kind of implements that are used in the story and maybe the dress and that sort of thing. Is that also true in terms of the masculine-feminine dynamic? Because we've seen such a gigantic change in the way women are participating in the world now. Is that affecting the way you're telling stories?
Some it is, but there's also there are also different types of storytellers. There are those who dress up and sort of dress up like the person they're telling about, or they make an outfit that suits the story they're telling.
Yeah.
And there are many who wear a hat or wear a certain costume when they're storytelling. And there's people like me. I never wear a certain costume. I just wear, like a neutral dress or whatever, because I love to wear colorful clothes, and I don't want to go into a costume, because then it's about me, and storytelling is not about me, it's about the story.
Interesting.
That's just my personal opinion. So I would never dress up in a costume to tell a story. I would never put on a certain hat or anything, but that's a very personal opinion, because I want to step behind the story. So I don't know if you know what I mean, but it's like a storyteller is not the important thing in a storytelling thing.
I get the point you're making. Do you ever use a prop like during the story to elicit a certain quality? Like perhaps one of the characters in your story is doing something, and you might lift up an implement that person might have used, or something like that?
No.
No. Okay.
I would do that. I have a new show that I made recently with a young man who plays the harp, and in that show I do a little music myself. I have a little thing that I make some sounds with that, and I have a drum that I use in the beginning. But I would never use props, because if I'm not able to, as a storyteller, to make the people make the images themselves, then it's not good. So maybe I can show it with my hands like I did before, the tiny little thread.
Yeah.
But you can see the thread. I don't need to have a thread. You can see it, because it's right in your imagination. So, and that's the role of the storyteller, is to create the images, and you cannot take responsibility for what images happen in the person's head, the one who's listening. But you can just invite them to see the images. And if you have a story and all of a sudden you take up a spoon, for example, like in any fairy tale, then You have maybe a wooden spoon or a metal spoon, but it's up to the listener himself to make up that spoon. And usually they will take a favorite spoon that they have. And if you bring up a spoon, then you will destroy that person's experience of the story.
Very
this
interesting.
Is a very personal opinion. I know there are lots and lots of storytellers who use props with big luck and good effects, but I don't do it.
Now that's very interesting. And how about in terms of using your voice? Will you change your voice for different characters?
No, I don't do that. But I maybe sometimes a little, but I only. There's so many words I need here. It's to sort of get the hint of it, to get a little
taste of it, yeah.
A taste of it. But I would die if I should go through a story with different voices. But there are people who are really, really good at that. But I get tired of listening when I have to listen to different voices, because I will be so afraid on behalf of that storyteller if he can remember all the different tones of the voices and so on. So I would be more occupied by that than listening to the story.
Yeah, I got you.
But of course, I use my voice. I whisper or I shout, but not a lot. I don't shout a lot because it really scares people. I can whisper, and that sometimes it makes a certain part of the story very intense.
Wow. Well, it's fascinating. So now the storytelling, the healing storytelling, that's very interesting. And so like as you said, you did hypnosis, so sometimes the storytelling would work its way into that. Would you ever advertise yourself as a healing storyteller?
No.
No.
No,
Okay.
it's just I have a blog that I call healingstory.dk, but it's not. I don't say I'm a healing storyteller, but I say I use storytelling as a healing art. I can go that far. And I was inspired by the Healing Story Alliance, and I asked them at that time when I wanted to make that web page if I could use the name, but with a Danish address, and they said yes. So, and there's also a well-known storyteller in America called Nancy Mellon, who's also calling her website Healing Story.
Okay. All right. So we have Marianne Christensen.dk.
Yes.
And healingstory.dk?
Yes.
Okay. And is that healing story spelled in English? It's in English.
Yeah, it is.
Okay.
Yes.
And wow. Well, we've
I even have a logo for that. If you want to see it here on my.
Oh, that's great. Oh yeah, I love that. Beautiful.
Yeah.
Now I've kept you about an hour. I don't know how long we can go in terms of my software, but are there? I guess if you could share with us some of the things you're most interested in right now in terms of what you're doing with storytelling. Like you're interested in raising awareness of storytelling, so maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yes, and I'm also that's because I make festivals and seminars about storytelling and also this living room storytelling. But I'm also, with my new performance, I've taken a step further, because this time, usually I just tell fairy tales just for fun and entertainment, but with this young man who's also a songwriter and wonderful harp player, we've made a play called When the Fairy Tale is Over, or When the Adventure is Over, and we've taken stories from the Arabian Nights. And in this is the first time that I've actually chosen stories to discuss a special issue. It's we've taken some of the naughty stories in the collection, because it's become very modern. Sex has become so it takes a lot of place in the discussions on the internet and everywhere, and I'm certainly not against sex, of course not, but I think that open marriages and people betraying each other and these kind of things it's totally okay with me, but we have to sort of think of what we're doing when we're doing it. So we're discussing this about when is a lie a lie. Is it a lie if you're not saying anything, or is it telling a truth if you are just leaving out a little bit of pieces or so on? So we're discussing that subject during or with our stories.
Beautiful.
And this is the first time that I've done that, and it's I'm very excited on how people will take it. I have already had the premiere, and people were very happy about it, but there weren't time for discussion afterwards. But I would like to discuss it with people. But it's a taboo, about lying and telling the truth and so on. And I'm not totally cleared out myself about how I feel about it. So
yes.
It's okay. I'm not a guardian of moral or anything. No way. But I'm allowed to take up a discussion and see how people react to it.
No, I love that. I think it's a huge point, and as you say, it's such a big part of kind of the evolution of our culture. It's like it's so much in the front of people's minds, and there has been this huge liberation, say, over the past 50 years in terms of sexual expression. And you're reminding me of something that Jung used to say or talk about, and I probably won't paraphrase this properly, but he kind of suggested that the dynamics of Christianity were no longer really adequate to address the needs of society. And in some ways, I think you see this in the sense that people are kind of leaving traditional religion, not entirely, but or that religion is having to change to accommodate modern trends. And I wonder if perhaps storytelling has a place here to pick up where these more perhaps patriarchal, perhaps overly traditional religious systems have failed, because there is this need for, like you were highlighting, honesty. And we want, if we are going to totally change these classical structures of how sexual relations are going to be lived out, we still need an ethical framework within which to do that, and perhaps storytelling can do that.
Yes, I think so, and that's why I'm trying to work with it that way. Because I want, of course, to be a very innocent entertainer, but also I need to take a point of view at some place, and that's why I've taken these way old stories that are very moral. They come from a totally different culture, and if the woman doesn't do what the husband wants, she just beats her up. And there are places in the world where people still do that and are allowed to do it. They can't just beat at certain places. And I really can't stand that way of thinking. So that's why I tell the story, but I also confront the audience with what if everybody just would beat up each other? What happens if we do that? And I want to sort of put light on things that are not really okay according to my way of thinking.
Yeah. Very interesting. I think that's powerful. It sounds really powerful. So now you say you do this with a musician. So when you're telling this kind of story, he's doing background music?
Yeah, well, he's a wonderful person, and he can tell stories himself. So we take shifts in telling, and it's like 1001 Nights, as we call it here, or Arabian Nights, is a long row of stories that just begin. And she stops right in the middle of the story before it becomes really exciting, so that she can sleep. And she saves her life for more than 3 years that way. The Scheherazade, she's telling to the king who wanted to kill all the virgins because his wife was faithful to him. And that's a frame story. So in this frame of stories, then there's many stories with many moral things like. But we don't take the stories that are good for children. We take the ones that are really juicy, where a woman has 3 lovers maybe, and there's a young slave girl who seduces a young boy, and so on. So
that's great. That's great.
Yeah.
It's like real. That's good.
Open stories, and then he plays. When I tell him to play the harp, and then he tells, and so we open a lot of stories, and then we tell one story that is finished, and then we start closing down the stories, if you can imagine, so that we start with the one.
Wow.
We end it, but we like it's like a box that we open another box and another box and another box, and then we close them down again.
That is beautiful. That sounds really good. Really good.
Yes.
All right. Well, I think we should wrap it up, Marianne. Is there any last words you'd like to add here?
Yeah, I want to pick up the thread that you mentioned when you said, how do I become confident in telling stories?
Yes.
I have one advice if somebody isn't already a storyteller. It's find the stories that speak to your heart, not your brain, but to your heart. And feel the story and learn the images in the story and then tell it from your own heart. Because the heart is very important. And if you tell from your heart, people will receive it with their heart.
Beautiful, beautiful. You know, and too, there's one other thing I want to ask you. Can you first tell the viewers what is a good resource for Danish stories? And then perhaps outside of Denmark, what are some good resources for stories?
Well, of course, you can get the Norse mythology. You can get that in many editions. And also Hans Christian Andersen is good. But there is a storyteller called Marianne Christensen. He has the folk tales.
Okay.
And I can write you that name afterwards in a mail so that you can get it correctly.
That would be great. Yeah, please send that to me. That'd be great.
Yeah, I'll send it to you. And some of his stories have been translated into English because there's a man in England who has spent a lot of time translating these stories, and they will be available on the internet. But all Hans Christian Andersen's stories are on the internet, available in English.
Okay.
So you can find them there, and you can just download them anytime. So that would be a good source, but you must remember that many of his stories are sort of worked with, and they're not the original folk tales.
Right.
But there are Norwegian folk tales and Swedish folk tales, and they are sort of the tradition that we have here.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, Marianne, it's a real pleasure. So I'll look forward to talking again, and perhaps sometime if you're interested, we could do just a video of one of your favorite stories, and we could post it online if you want to do it, or perhaps you prefer to have a live audience. I don't know, but.
Oh, that's fine. You seem alive enough. So I could tell the story to you. That would be perfect.
All right. Beautiful. Beautiful. All right. Well, Marianne, I look forward to further discussions. I'm going to let you go eat something.
Yes, thank you. Okay, maybe one day I'll come to Virginia. You never know.
Oh, you are always welcome. You let me know if you come to the States. You have a place to stay. Absolutely.
Okay. I'll think about it because I have 3 brothers who live over there, so there might be a reason to come.
Excellent. Where are they located?
Well, one in Pennsylvania, one in Oklahoma, and one in California.
All right. Very good.
Good. Well, thank you very much, Paul. It was really nice meeting you, and I look forward to see what comes out of this, and maybe a lot of things we can do together. So.
That's great. That sounds good, Marianne.
Yes. Okay.
How do I say goodbye and thank you in Danish?
Farvel og tak.
Farvel og tak.
Yes. Very
Okay.
good.
See you.
Yeah, see you.